You've mentioned censorship a few times. Let us, if we can, go deep into the darkness of the past and how censorship mechanism was used. So you are a good person to speak about the history of this because you were there on the ground floor in 2013-ish. Facebook. I heard that you were there when they invented or maybe developed the term hate speech in the context of censorship on social media. So take me through that history, if you can, the use of censorship.
So I was there on the ground floor in 1983.
There's multiple floors to this building, apparently.
There are.
Yeah.
So I got the first ask to implement censorship on the internet, which was in the web browser.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. 1982. I was asked to implement a nudity filter.
Did you have the courage to speak up back then?
I did not have any problem speaking up back then. I was making $6.25 an hour. I did not have a lot to lose. No, I was asked at the time. And look, it's legitimate, in some sense, a legitimate request, which is working on a research project actually funded by the federal government at a public university. So, I don't think my boss was like in any way out of line, but it was like, yeah, like this web browser thing is great, but like, could it just make sure to not have any photos of naked people that show up? But if you think about this for a second as a technologist, I had an issue, which is this was like pre-ImageNet, right? And so I had a brief period where I tried to imagine an algorithm that I referred to as the breast detection algorithm that I was going to have to design. And then apparently a variety of other body parts people are also sensitive about.
Yeah.
And then I politely declined to do this.
For just the technical difficulties of it.
Well, number one, I actually didn't know how to do it. But number two is just like, no, I'm just not building a censorship engine. Like I'm just not doing it. And in those days it was, in those days, the internet generally was, a free fire zone for everything. It was actually interesting. It's sort of pre-93, the internet was such a specific niche community. Like it was like the million kind of highest IQ nerds in the world. And so it actually like didn't really have a lot of, issues that people were like super interested in talking about, like astrophysics, and not very interested in, even politics at that time. So there really was not an issue there. But I didn't want to start the process. So I think the way to think about this. So first of all, so I was involved in this at Facebook every step. By the way, I've been involved in this at Facebook every step of the way. I joined the board there in 2007. So I've seen everything in the last, almost 20 years, every step of the way. But also I've been involved in most of the other companies over time. So I was an angel investor in Twitter, knew them really well. We were the founding investor in Substack. I'm part of the Elon takeover of Twitter with X. I was an angel at LinkedIn. So I've been in these, we were the funder of Pinterest. We were one of the main investors there. Reddit as well. And I was having these conversations with all these guys all the way through. So as much talk specifically about Facebook, but I can just tell you like the general pattern. And for quite a while, it was kind of all the same across these companies. So basically the way to think about this, the true kind of nuanced view of this is that there is, practically speaking, no internet service that can have zero censorship. And by the way, that also mirrors, there is no country that actually has unlimited free speech either. The U.S. First Amendment actually has 12 or 13 formal carve-outs from the Supreme Court over time, so incitement to violence and terrorist recruitment and child abuse. And so, child pornography and so forth they're not covered by the First Amendment. And just practically speaking, if you and I are going to start an internet company and have a service, we can't have that stuff either, right? Because it's illegal, or it will just clearly, destroy the whole thing. So you're always going to have a censorship engine. I mean, hopefully it's not actually in the browser, but like you're going to have it for sure at the level of an internet service. But then what happens is now you have a machine, right? Now you have a system where you can put in rules saying we allow this, we don't allow that. You have enforcement, you have consequences, right? And once that system is in place, like it becomes the ring of power. Right, which is like, okay, now anybody in that company or anybody associated with that company or anybody who wants to pressure that company will just start to say, okay, you should use that machine for more than just terrorist recruitment and child pornography. You should use it for XYZ. And basically that transition happened, call it 2012, 2013, is when there was this like very, very kind of rapid pivot. I think the kickoff to it for some reason was it was the beginning of the second Obama term. I think it also coincided with the sort of arrival of the first kind of super woke kids into these schools. That kind of, it's the kids that were in school between like, for the Iraq war and then the global financial crisis. And like, they came out like super radicalized. They came into these companies. They immediately started mounting these social crusades to ban and censor lots of things. And then, quite frankly, the Democratic Party figured this out, and they figured out that these companies were, very subject to being controlled, and the executive teams and boards of directors are almost all Democrats, and there's tremendous circulation. A lot of Obama people from the first term actually came and worked in these companies, and a lot of FBI people and other law enforcement intelligence people came in and worked, and they're all they were all Democrats for that set. And so they just the ring of power was lying on the table. It had been built. And they, picked it up and put it on, and then they just ran. And the original discussions were basically always on two topics. It was hate speech and misinformation. Hate speech was the original one. And the hate speech conversation started exactly like you'd expect, which is we can't have the N-word, in which the answer is fair enough. Let's not have the N-word. Okay. Now we've set a precedent. Right. And then Jordan Peterson has talked a lot about this. The definition of hate speech ended up being things that make people uncomfortable. Right. So we can't have things that make, people uncomfortable. I, of course, people like me that are disagreeable raise their hands and say, well, that idea right there makes me uncomfortable. But of course, that doesn't count as hate speech. Right. So, the ring of power is on one hand and not on the other hand. And then basically that began this slide where it ended up being that, completely anodyne. This is a point Mark has been making recently, like completely anodyne comments that are completely legitimate on television or on the Senate floor, all of a sudden are hate speech and can't be said online. So that, the ring of power was wielded in grossly irresponsible ways. We can talk about all the stuff that happened there. And then the other one was misinformation. And that wasn't there was a little bit of that early on, but of course that really kicked in with Trump. So the hate speech stuff predated Trump by like 3 or 4 years. The misinformation stuff was basically, it was a little bit later, and it was a consequence of the Russiagate hoax. And then that was, a ring of power that was even more powerful, right? Because, hate speech is like, okay, at some point, if something offensive or not, like at least you can have a question as to whether that's the case. But the problem with misinformation is like, is it the truth or not? What do we know from 800 years or whatever Western civilization? It's that, there's only a few entities that can determine the truth on every topic. There's God. There's the king. We don't have those anymore. And the rest of us are all imperfect and flawed. And so the idea that any group of experts is going to sit around the table and decide on the truth is, deeply anti-Western and deeply authoritarian. And somehow the misinformation kind of crusade went from the Russiagate hoax into just full-blown, we're going to use that weapon for whatever we want. And then of course, the culminating moment on that really was the straw that broke the camel's back was, we're going to censor all theories that the COVID virus might have been manufactured in a lab as misinformation. And inside these companies, like that was the point where people for the first time, this is like 3 years ago, for the first time they were like, that was when it sunk in, where it's just like, okay, this has spun completely out of control. So anyway, that's how we got to where we are. And then basically that spell lasted, that complex existed and got expanded basically from call it 2013 to 2023. I think basically two things broke it. One is Substack. And I'm super proud of those guys because they started from scratch and declared right up front that they were going to be a free speech platform. And they came under intense pressure, including from the press, and, that tried to just beat them to the ground and kill them. And intense pressure, by the way, from, let's say certain of the platform companies, basically threatening them. And they stood up to it. And, sitting here today, they have the widest spectrum of speech and conversation, anywhere on planet Earth. And they've done a great job. And it's worked, by the way, it's great. And then obviously Elon, with X was the hammer blow. And then the third one now is what Mark is doing at Facebook.
Mm-hmm. And there's also like singular moments. I think you've spoken about this, which like Jon Stewart going on Stephen Colbert and talking about the lab leak theory.
Yes.
There's certain moments that just kind of shake everybody up. The right person, the right time, it's a wake-up call.
So that there, and I will tell you, like, and I should say, Jon Stewart attacked me recently, so I'm not that thrilled about him. But I would say I was a long-run fan of Jon Stewart. I watched probably every episode of The Daily Show when he was on it for probably 20 years. But he did a very important public service, and it was that appearance on the Colbert Show. And I don't know how broadly this is, at the time it was in the news briefly, but I don't know if people remember this, but I will tell you in the rooms where people discuss what is misinformation and these policies, that was a very big moment. That was probably actually the key catalyzing moment. And I think he exhibited, I would say, conspicuous bravery and had a big impact with that. What for people who don't recall what he did, and this was in the full blown, like you absolutely must lock down for 2 years. You absolutely must keep all the schools closed. You absolutely must have everybody work from home. You absolutely must wear a mask, like the whole thing. And one of those was you absolutely must believe that COVID was completely natural. You must believe that. And not believing that means you're a fascist Nazi Trump supporter, mega evil QAnon person, right? And that was like uniform. And that was enforced by the social media companies. And like I said, that was the peak. And Jon Stewart went on the Colbert Show, and I don't know if they planned it or not, because Colbert looked shocked. I don't know how much of it was a bit, but he went on there and he just had one of these like the emperor is wearing no clothes things, where he said it's just not plausible that you had the COVID supervirus appear 300 yards down the street from the Wuhan Institute of of lethal coronaviruses. Like, it's just not plausible that certainly that you could just rule that out. And then there was another key moment, actually. The more serious version was, I think, the author Nicholson Baker wrote a big piece for New York Magazine. And Nicholson Baker is like one of our great novelist writers of our time, and he wrote the piece and he did the complete undressing of it. And that was the first, I think that was the first legit, there had been like renegade, there had been, people running around saying this, but getting censored all over the place. That was the first one that was like in the mainstream press, where he talked to all the heretics, and he just like laid the whole thing out. And that was a moment. And I remember, let's say, a board meeting at one of these companies after that, where basically, everybody looked around the table and it was like, all right, like, I guess we don't need to censor that anymore. And, and then of course, what immediately follows from that is, well, wait a minute, why were we censoring that in the first place? And okay, like, and then, the downstream, not that day, but the downstream conversations were like, okay, if we made such a giant, in retrospect, if we all made such a giant collective mistake censoring that, then what does that say about the rest of our regime? And I think that was the thread in the sweater that started to unravel it.
I should say it again. I do think that the Jon Stewart appearance and the statement he made was a courageous act.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think we need to have more of that in the world. And like you said, Elon, everything he did with X is a series of courageous acts. And I think what Mark Zuckerberg did on Rogan a few days ago is a courageous act. Yeah. Can you just speak to that?
He has become, I think, an outstanding communicator, right? And he's, somebody who came in for a lot of criticism earlier in his career on that front. And I think he's one of these guys who can sit down and talk for 3 hours and make complete sense. And as you do with all of your episodes, like when somebody sits and talks for 3 hours, like you really get a sense of somebody, because it's really hard to be artificial for that long. And he's now done that repeatedly. He's really good at it. And then look, I would maybe put him in the third category now with certainly after that appearance. I would say I would put him up there now with kind of Elon and Trump, in the sense of the public and the private are now synchronized. I guess I'd say that. Like he said on that show what he really believes. He said all the same things that he says in private. Like, I don't think there's really any discrepancy anymore. I would say he has always taken upon himself a level of obligation and responsibility to running a company the size of Meta and to running services that are that large. And I think, his conception of what he's doing, which I think is correct, is he's running services that are bigger than any country, right? He's running, over 3 billion people use those services. And then, the company has, many tens of thousands of employees and many investors, and it's a public company, and he thinks very deeply and seriously about his responsibilities. And so, he has not felt like he has had, let's just say, the complete flexibility that Elon has had. And, people could argue that one way or the other, but, he talked about it a lot. He's evolved a lot. A lot of it was he learned a lot. And by the way, I'm going to put myself right back up there. Like, I'm not claiming any huge foresight or heroism on any of this. Like, I've also learned a lot. My views on things are very different than they were 10 years ago on lots of topics. And so, I've been on a learning journey. He's been on a learning journey. He is a really, really good learner. He assimilates information, as good as or better than anybody else I know. The other thing I guess I would just say is he talked on that show about something very important, which is when you're in a role where you're running a company like that, there are a set of decisions that you get to make, and you deserve to be criticized for those decisions and so forth, and it's valid. But you are under tremendous external pressure as well. And by the way, you're under tremendous internal pressure. You've got your employees coming at you. You've got your executives in some cases coming at you. You've got your board in some cases coming at you. You've got your shareholders coming at you. So you've got your internal pressures, but you also have the press coming at you. You've got academia coming at you. You've got the entire nonprofit complex activist complex coming at you. And then really critically, he talked about on Rogan, and these companies all went through this. In this last, especially 5 years, you had the government coming at you. And, that's the really, stinky end of the pool, where, the government was, in my view, illegally exerting, just in flagrant violation of the First Amendment and federal laws on speech and coercion and conspiracy, forcing these companies to engage in activities, that, again, in some cases they may have wanted to do, but in other cases they clearly didn't want to do and felt like they had to do. And the level of pressure, like I just say, like I've known every CEO of Twitter. They've all had the exact same experience, which when they were in the job, it was just daily beatings. Like it's just getting punched in the face every single day, constantly. And, Mark is very good at getting physically punched in the face.
Getting better and better, yeah.
And he is, and he, and he's very good at, taking a punch, and he has taken many, many punches. So I would encourage people to have a level of sympathy for, these are not kings. These are people who operate with, like, I would say, extraordinary levels of external pressure. I think if I had been in his job for the last decade, I would be a little puddle on the floor. And so it says, I think, a lot about him that he has, risen to this occasion the way that he has. And by the way, I should also say, the cynicism, of course, is immediately out. And, it's a legitimate thing for people to say, but, it's like, oh, you're only doing this because of Trump or, whatever. And it's just like, no, like he has been thinking about and working on these things and trying to figure them out for a very long time. And so I think what you saw are legitimate, deeply held beliefs, not some, sort of just in the moment thing that could change at any time.
So what do you think it's like to be him and other leaders of companies, to be you and withstand internal pressure and external pressure? What's that life like? Is it deeply lonely?
That's a great question. So leaders are lonely to start with. And this is one of those things where almost nobody has sympathy, right? Nobody feels sorry for a CEO, right? Like it's not a thing. Right. And again, legitimately so. Like CEOs get paid a lot, like the whole thing. There's a lot of great things about it. So it's not like they should be out there asking for a lot of sympathy, but it is the case that they are human beings. And it is the case that it is a lonely job. And the reason it's a lonely job is because your words carry tremendous weight. And you are dealing with extremely complicated issues, and you're under a tremendous amount of emotional, personal emotional stress. And, you often end up not being able to sleep well, and you end up not being able to like keep up an exercise routine and all those things. And, you come under family stress because you're working all the time. Or my partner, Ben, he was CEO of our last company before we started the venture firm. He said, the problem he had like with his family life was he would, even when he was home at night, he wasn't home, because he was in his head trying to solve all the business problems. And so he was like supposed to be like having dinner with his kids, and he was physically there, but he wasn't mentally there. So, you kind of get that a lot. But the key thing is like, you can't talk to people, right? So you can talk to your spouse and your kids, but like, they don't understand that they're not working in your company. They don't understand, have the context to really help you. If you talk to your executives, they all have agendas, right? And so they're all, and they can't resist. Like, it's just human nature. And so you can't necessarily rely on what they say. It's very hard in most companies to talk to your board because they can fire you, right? Now Mark has the situation because he has control. It actually turns out he can talk to his board, and Mark talks to us about many things that he does that most CEOs won't talk to their boards about because we can't fire him. But a general CEO, including all the CEOs of Twitter, that none of them had control, and so they could all get fired. So you can't talk to the board members; they're going to fire you. You can't talk to the shareholders because they'll just like dump your stock. Right. Like, okay, so who's so every once in a while, what you find is basically the best case scenario they have is they can talk to other CEOs. And there's these little organizations where they kind of pair up and do that. And so they maybe get a little bit out of that. But even that's fraught with peril, because can you really talk about confidential information with another CEO, insider trading risk? And so it's just a very lonely and isolating thing to start with. And then on top of that, you apply pressure. Right. And that's where it gets painful. And then maybe I'll just spend a moment on this internal, external pressure thing. My general experience with companies is that they can withstand most forms of external pressure as long as they retain internal coherence. Right. So as long as the internal team is really bonded together and supporting each other, most forms of external pressure you can withstand. And by that, I mean, investors dump your stock, you lose your biggest customers, whatever, negative article, negative headline, you can withstand all that. And basically, in fact, many of those forms of pressure can be bonding experiences for the team where they come out stronger. What you 100% cannot withstand is the internal crack. And what I always look for in high pressure corporate situations now is the moment when the internal team cracks, because I know the minute that happens, we're in a different regime. Like, it's like the solid is turned into a liquid. Like, we're in a different regime, and like the whole thing can unravel in the next week, because then people turn it. I mean, this is what's happening in Los Angeles right now. The mayor and the fire chief turned on each other, and that's it. That government is dysfunctional. It is never going to get put back together again. It is over. It is not going to work ever again. And that's what happens inside companies. And so somebody like Marc is under like profound internal pressure and external pressure at the same time. Now, he's been very good at maintaining the coherence of his executive team, but he has had over the years a lot of activist employees, as a lot of these companies have had. And so that's been continuous pressure. And then the final thing I'd say is I said that companies can withstand most forms of external pressure, but not all. And the special, though not all one, is government pressure. Is that when your government comes for you, like, yeah, any CEO who thinks that they're bigger than their government has that notion beaten out of them in short order.
Can you just linger on that? Because it is maybe educating and deeply disturbing. You've spoken about it before, but worth speaking about again, this government pressure. So you think they've crossed the line into essentially criminal levels of pressure?
Flagrant criminality. Felonies, like obvious felonies. And I can actually cite the laws. But yes, absolute criminality.
Can you explain how those possible to happen, and maybe on a hopeful note, how we can avoid that happening again?
So to start with, is a lot of this now is in the public record, which is good because it needs to be in the public record. And so there's three forms of things that are in the public record that people can look at. So one is the Twitter files, right, which Elon put out with the set of journalists when he took over. And I will just tell you, the Twitter files are 100% representative of what I've seen at every other one of these companies. And so you can just see what happened in Twitter, and you can just assume that happened in these other companies, for the most part, certainly in terms of the kind of pressure that they got. So that's number one. That stuff, you can just read it, and you should if you haven't. The second is, Marc referenced this in the Rogan podcast. There's a Congressman, Jim Jordan, who has a congressional committee called the Weaponization Committee. And they, in the last, 3 years, have done a full-scale investigation of this. And Facebook produced a lot of documents into that investigation. And many of those have now been made public. And you can download those reports. And there's like 2,000 pages worth of material on that. And that's essentially the Facebook version of the Twitter files, just arrived at with a different mechanism. And then third is Marc himself talking about this on Rogan. So I'll, just defer to his comments there. But yeah, basically what those three forms of information show you is basically the government, over time, and then culminating in 2020, 2021, in the last 4 years, just decided that the First Amendment didn't apply to them. And they just decided that federal laws around free speech and around conspiracies to take away the rights of citizens just don't apply. And they just decided that they can just arbitrarily pressure, just like literally arbitrarily call up companies and threaten and bully, and yell and scream and threaten repercussions and force them to censor. And there's this old thing of like, well, the First Amendment only applies to the government; it doesn't apply to companies. It's like, well, there's actually a little bit of nuance to that. First of all, it definitely applies to the government. Like 100%, the First Amendment applies to the government. By the way, so does the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, including the right to due process, also applies to the government. There was no due process at all to any of the censorship regime that was put in place. There was no due process put in place, by the way, for debanking either. Those are just as serious violations as the free speech violations. And so this is just like flagrant unconstitutional behavior. And then there are specific federal statutes. It's 18241 and 18242. And one of them applies to federal employees, government employees, and the other one applies to private actors. Around what's called deprivation of rights and conspiracy to deprive rights. And it is not legal, according to the United States Criminal Code, for government employees or in a conspiracy private entities to take away constitutional rights. And interestingly, some of those constitutional rights are enumerated, for example, in the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And then some of those rights actually do not need to be enumerated. If the government takes away rights that you have, they don't need to be specifically enumerated rights in the Constitution in order to still be a felony. The Constitution does not say you only have the rights that it gives you. It says you have all the rights that have not been previously defined as being taken away from you, right? And so debanking qualifies as a right. Right to access to the financial system is every bit something that's subject to these laws as free speech. And so this has happened. And then I'll just add one final thing, which is we've talked about two parties so far. We've talked about the government employees, and then we've talked about the companies. The government employees for sure have misbehaved. The companies, there's a very interesting question there as to whether they are victims or perpetrators or both. They will defend and they will argue, and I believe they have a good case that they are victims, not perpetrators, right? They are the downstream subjects of pressure, not the cause of pressure. But there's a big swath of people who are in the middle, and specifically the ones that are funded by the government that I think are in possibly pretty big trouble. And that's all of these third-party censorship bureaus. The one that sort of is most obvious is the so-called Stanford Internet Observatory that got booted up there over the last several years. And they basically were funded by the federal government to be third-party censorship operations. And they're private sector actors, but acting with federal funding. And so it puts them in this very interesting spot where there could be very obvious theory under which they're basically acting as agents of the government. And so I think they're also very exposed on this and have behaved in just flagrantly illegal ways.
So fundamentally, government should not do any kind of pressure, even soft pressure, on companies to censor.
Can't. Not allowed.
It really is disturbing. I mean, it probably started soft, lightly, slowly, and then it escalates as the old will to power will instruct them to do. Because you get. That's why there's protection, because you can't put a check on power for government, right?
There are so many ways that they can get you. Like, there are so many ways they can come at you and get you. And the thing here to think about is, a lot of times when people think about government action, they think about legislation, right? Because when I was a kid, we got trained at how does government work. There was this famous animated short the thing we got shown was just a cartoon of how a bill becomes a law. And it's like this, fancy little bill snicked along and goes this.
I'm just a bill. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Like, it's like, all right, number one, that's not how it works at all. Like that doesn't actually happen. We could talk about that. But even beyond that, mostly what we're dealing with is not legislation. When we talk about government power these days, mostly it's not legislation. Mostly it's either regulation, which is basically the equivalent of legislation, but having not gone through the legislative process, which is a very big open legal issue and one of the things that the Doge is very focused on. Most government rules are not legislated; they're regulated, and there's tons and tons of regulations that these companies are. This is another cliche you'll hear a lot, which is, private companies can do whatever they want. And it's like, oh no, they can't. They're subject to tens of thousands of regulations that they have to comply with. And the hammer that comes down when you don't comply with regulations is profound. Like, they can completely wreck your company with no ability for you to do anything about it. So regulation is a big part of the way the power gets exercised. And then there's what's called just flat out administrative power, is the term that you'll hear. And administrative power is just literally the government calling you and telling you what to do. Here's an example of how this works. So Facebook had this whole program a few years back to do a global cryptocurrency for payments called Libra. And they built the entire system, and it was this high scale, sort of new cryptocurrency, and they were going to build it in every product, and there were going to be 3 billion people who could transact with Libra. And they went to the government, and they went to all these different, try to figure out how to make it so it's like fully compliant with anti-money laundering and all these, controls and everything. And they had the whole thing ready to go. 2 senators wrote letters to the big banks saying, we're not telling you that you can't work with Facebook on this, but if you do, you should know that every aspect of your business is going to come under greatly increased level of regulatory scrutiny. Which is, of course, the exact equivalent of, it sure is a nice corner restaurant you have here. It would be a shame if, somebody tossed a Molotov cocktail through the window and burned it down tonight, right? And so that letter, like, what is that letter? Like, it's not a law. It's not even a regulation. It's just like straight, direct state power. And then it culminates in literally calls from the White House, where they're just like flat out telling you what to do, which is, of course, what a king gets to do, but not what a president gets to do. And so anyway, so what these companies experienced was they experienced the full panoply of this, but it was the level of intensity was in that order. It was actually legislation was the least important part. Regulation was more important. Administrative power was more important. And then just like flat out demands and flat out threats were ultimately the most important. How do you fix it? Well, first of all, like, you have to elect people who don't do it. Right? So, like, as with all these things, ultimately the fault lies with the voters. And so, you have to decide you don't want to live in that regime. I have no idea what part of this recent election mapped to the censorship regime. I do know a lot of people on the right got very angry about the censorship, but I think it probably at least helped with enthusiasm on that side. Maybe some people on the left will now not want their, Democratic nominees to be so pro-censorship. So the voters definitely, get a vote. Number one. Number two, I think you need transparency. You need to know what happened. We know some of what happened. Peter Thiel has written in the FT just now saying we just need after what we've been through in the last decade, we need broad-based truth and reconciliation, efforts to really get to the root of things. So maybe that's part of it. We need investigations for sure. Ultimately, we need prosecutions. Like we need people to go to jail because we need to set object lessons that say that you don't get to do this. And on those last two, I would say that those are both up to the new administration, and I don't want to speak for them, and I don't want to predict what they're going to do, but they for sure have the ability to do both of those things, and we'll see where they take it.
Yeah, it's truly disturbing. I don't think anybody wants this kind of overreach of power for government, including perhaps people that were participating in it. It's like this dark momentum of power that you just get caught up in it. And that's the reason there's that kind of protection. Nobody wants that.
So I use the metaphor of the Ring of Power, and
Yeah.
for people who don't catch the reference, that's Lord of the Rings. And the thing with the Ring of Power and Lord of the Rings, it's the ring that Gollum has in the beginning, and it turns you invisible, and it turns out it like unlocks all this like fearsome power. It's the most powerful thing in the world. It's the key to everything. And basically the moral lesson of Lord of the Rings, which was, written by a guy who thought very deeply about these things, is, the Ring of Power is inherently corrupting. The characters at one point, they're like, Gandalf, just put on the ring and like fix this. Right. And he's like, he will not put the ring on even to like end the war, because he knows that it will corrupt him. And then, the character, as it starts, the character of Gollum is the result of, it's like a normal character who ultimately becomes, this incredibly corrupt and deranged version of himself. And so, I mean, I think you said something actually quite profound there, which is the Ring of Power is infinitely tempting. The censorship machine is infinitely tempting. If you have it, like, you are going to use it. It's overwhelmingly tempting because it's so powerful, and then it will corrupt you. And yeah, I don't know whether any of these people feel any of this today. They should. I don't know if they do. But yeah, you go out 5 or 10 years later, you would hope that you would realize that your soul has been corroded, and you probably started out thinking that you were a patriot and you were trying to defend democracy, and you ended up being, extremely authoritarian and anti-democratic and anti-Western.